Mark chapter 15. In this chapter we come to the trial, crucifixion, and burial of Jesus. These last two chapters in Mark, chapters 15 and 16, are the place toward which the entire gospel has been moving. The question of Mark's gospel has been asking throughout, who is this person Jesus? And that question will finally only be answered in these last two chapters. In these last two chapters, the disciples and the world will finally come to understand the identity of Jesus. Well, one of the things we often overlook in the account of the death of Jesus is how quickly all this will happen. On Thursday, Jesus was teaching in the temple. He was walking around freely. But by 9 o'clock in the morning on Friday, he was being nailed to the cross. Now, needless to say, the dispensing of justice was not the primary concern for the religious leaders or Pontius Pilate. They had other concerns, and they were mostly protecting their own interests. So Mark 15 begins with the conclusion of the trial of Jesus before the religious leaders. Even though the trial of Jesus had essentially taken place at night, something that was highly improper, the religious leaders knew they could not finally decide the matter during the night. For one thing, many of the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, were probably in bed and not there. And for another, you could not pronounce a verdict at night, only during the day. So hurriedly, as soon as possible after dawn, they scrambled to get everyone together. And Mark mentions the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, and the whole council. Now, there is an interesting absence among these groups, and it is the Pharisees. They always seem to be plotting against Jesus and are clearly on the same page with everyone else against him, but they were a religious renewal group and not in the official leadership of the nation. There would have been some Pharisees on the Sanhedrin, but it was typically dominated by the Sadducees. So this chapter opens with Mark reporting that when everyone was gathered together, they quickly decided to send Jesus to Pilate. Now, Pilate would typically have held trials first thing in the morning and would have been prepared to deal with whatever people brought to him. This was when he held court, so it was not unusual for him to be ready to hear various cases in the morning. Now, Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea at this time. We know from other sources that he was the governor of Judea from 26 AD until 36 AD, and this exactly fits with the time frame given in the Gospels and makes this credible as a historical event. We have both historical and archaeological evidence of Pontius Pilate as a real person. In 1961, an inscription on a piece of stone from the first century was found in Caesarea by the Sea, which was the Roman headquarters. It had Pontius Pilate's name on it. It was on an inscription for a building that Pilate dedicated to the then Emperor Tiberius, and it names Pilate as the prefect of Judea. We also have a number of written historical sources mentioning Pilate as ruling in this area during this time, such as Jewish historian Josephus. Now, the reason the Jews brought Jesus to Pilate was that Judea was a Roman province and not under control of the Jews. It had been a Roman province since 6 BC, over 20 years before, and before that time it was ruled by Jewish kings. Herod the Great had ruled the region for 34 years. When he died, his son Archelaus ruled in his place, but Archelaus was accused of being excessively cruel to his subjects, something Caesar had specifically instructed him not to do. So Caesar Augustus deposed Archelaus in the year 6 BC, and the region was made a Roman province at that point and would remain so until Herod Agrippa I was again made a Jewish king over the region in 44 AD. Now, the Roman capital of Judea was not Jerusalem. It was Caesarea by the Sea, and this is where Pilate would normally have resided. But he came to Jerusalem during the festivals to make sure in person that no riots broke out. The Jews were notorious for rebelling, and a main part of Pilate's job was to make sure they did not do so. And so Pilate was in town, and he was the supreme authority when he was in town. The Jews had certain privileges. They seem to have been free to stone Stephen, which happened about 5 years after the crucifixion, and that's in Acts chapter 7. But Jesus was a famous person, and it seems like they did not feel like they could execute Jesus themselves, but needed Roman authority, especially when Pilate was in town. This was also a spur-of-the-moment plan that presented itself because of the sudden agreement by Judas to betray Jesus. Well, from the first question of Pilate, we see that they brought Jesus to him on a charge of sedition. Questions of religious nature such as blasphemy would have not concerned Pilate, but sedition was something he had to address. Jesus' answer to him when Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" is affirmative but evasive. Jesus replies, "You have said so." And the Jews must have thought their case was not going well because it says they accused Jesus of many things. Now, in the next section about Barabbas, we see how reluctant Pilate was to sentence Jesus to death. Our outside sources for the life of Pilate, such as Philo and Josephus, tend to picture Pilate as really not a very nice person. He was cruel, vindictive, inflexible. He will sometimes do things just to annoy the Jews. He's easily angered. And he will on a number of occasions set his troops loose on the citizens, afflicting casualties for very little reason. So it's a rocky relationship, and in the year 36 AD, he will be removed as the procurator. And it's interesting, however, that the Gospels tend to paint Pilate in a slightly more benevolent light. He wants to release Jesus because he believes him innocent, but in the end is not able to do so. Well, the Gospels are our only record of the custom of Pilate of releasing a prisoner during the festival, but it would not have been out of the ordinary for a governor to do such a thing as a way of building good relationships with his subjects. And we see here that he's hoping that they will ask for Jesus. He even prompts the crowd, saying, "Do you want me then to release to you the king of the Jews?" But the crowd had been stirred up, Mark says, by the chief priests, and so they cried out for Barabbas. We don't have any record of Barabbas outside the Gospels or his crimes, but he seems to have been a zealot who had been involved in some sort of rebellion against the authorities, and as we said, these happened all the time in that area, and he seems to have committed a murder in the process. So when they cried out for Barabbas, Pilate asked again, "So what do you want me to do with the king of the Jews?" He was hoping perhaps to give Jesus a lighter sentence than the death sentence. But we see here how fickle crowds can be. Jesus had been very popular with the people every time he came to Jerusalem. Even that very week, crowds had hung on his every word as he taught. But perhaps seeing Jesus arrested and in the hands of Pilate, some changed their mind. Perhaps they thought he was an impostor and not the true Messiah. But whatever the case, they are easily swayed by the priests, and they shout for Jesus to be crucified. And here we see Pilate's own self-interest prevail. He didn't want to anger the crowd, and so he sentenced Jesus to be flogged and crucified. Now, Mark here seems to have compressed the story a bit. The Gospel of John reports that Pilate made one more attempt to explain to the crowd that Jesus was innocent. He did not deserve the death sentence. And John reports that after he had flogged Jesus, and Jesus would have been visibly badly beaten, Pilate brought him out to the crowd again, but again could make no headway. Flogging Jesus was meant to pacify the crowd, but may have actually served to stir them up, as the flogging may have very well taken place right in front of the palace and in view of all the people, and the sight of the blood might have brought them to an even greater frenzy. So when Pilate could not make any headway with them, he eventually gave in to the demands of the crowd that Jesus be crucified. And this whole scene was apparently getting very ugly. Matthew reports that Pilate realized that a riot was just about to break out, and that is exactly what Pilate wanted to avoid. So he sentenced Jesus to be crucified, and Pontius Pilate remains in history an example of someone who chose what was expedient over what was right. Well, next we come to the account of the soldiers mocking Jesus. The soldiers would have been a part of Pilate's contingent of troops who accompanied him to Jerusalem from Caesarea, his headquarters, and it seems that they had some time on their hands and they used it to make fun of Jesus. As we know that two others were crucified with Jesus, perhaps the soldiers were waiting for their trials to be over before they made their way to Golgotha. Now, what strikes us about this account is its insensitivity. The soldiers would not have been Jews, obviously, and thus some of their mockery might have been because of their scorn for the Jewish people in general, but they clearly reveled in the opportunity to torment someone who was sentenced to death. Well, so this is another part of the suffering of Jesus that we should not overlook. They not only mocked him and they spat on him, but they struck him. The thorns in that area run over an inch long, and when the crown of thorns was placed on his head, they may have well punctured the skull, an area that bleeds freely. And so this probably would have been the case, certainly when they hit him on the head with a rod and drove the thorns into the skin. And when they finally pulled the purple robe off his back, it may already have stuck to the drying blood, reopening the wounds when it was removed. And so all of this was insult added to injury, and Christ received no mercy. Humanly speaking, it must have been a time in which he felt supremely alone. Now, Mark notes that the soldiers compelled a passerby to carry Jesus' cross. This was probably a Jewish pilgrim in town for the festival, though he could have been a Gentile. It is interesting that he is named in 3 of the 4 Gospels as Simon of Cyrene. Cyrene was a town on the coast of North Africa in what we now know as Libya. Mark also mentions his 2 sons, Alexander and Rufus, and we wonder why their names are mentioned. An obvious conclusion is that Simon and his sons would be among the early Christian believers, and perhaps people known in Rome, where Mark probably wrote his gospel. Interestingly, in Romans chapter 16, verse 13, Paul extends greetings to someone named Rufus, whom he calls chosen in the Lord. And this may be a reference to his father being picked out of the crowd for a final act of service to Jesus on his way to the cross. Now, Mark mentions that Jesus, once crucified, was mocked by the passers-by, particularly the religious leaders. They reveled in this moment. He saved others, but he can't save himself. If this is the Messiah, if he would come down from the cross, we will believe in him. And Mark says that those who were crucified also mocked him. Now, Luke, however, records a detail of which Mark was apparently not aware. Only one of the criminals mocked Jesus. The other would defend him and ask for mercy from him, and Jesus would say to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Now, the death of Jesus was accompanied by a number of things that would have marked it as unusual. Certainly the darkness that came over the land from noon until Christ's death around 3 would have been ominous. Perhaps there was something different about the manner in which Jesus comported himself on the cross as well. We cannot be sure. And Jesus cried out just before he died and breathed his last. His cry is a quotation from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And most theologians see this not so much as an expression of Jesus' feelings, but an indication of what was taking place on the cross. God the Father was turning away from his beloved Son, on whom the weight of sin rested. And since God cannot look on sin, he was forced to turn away his gaze, and Jesus experienced abandonment on the cross. And this was the cup Jesus dreaded to drink, but this was what it meant for Jesus to truly bear the weight of our sins in his soul. And in doing so, he satisfied both the justice and the mercy of God and bore the penalty for our sins. Well, Mark says that the centurion was quite moved by the events and recognized that some very unusual things had taken place, and it caused him to exclaim, "Surely this man was the Son of God." And for all devout Jews, the tearing of the temple veil would certainly have been an event never before heard of. That it would suddenly rip from the top to the bottom all by itself must have been seen as a great sign. It was also one that the chief priests no doubt tried to hush up as much as possible. And for Christians, this is just another indication of what Christ did on the cross. He opened the way to God for us, the way into his presence. There is no longer anything that separates us from God because of what Christ has done. Well, the burial of Jesus is reported very simply. A member of the Jewish council who had not been in agreement with them came and asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. When Pilate was assured that Jesus was truly dead, he gave it to him, and he buried it in a tomb cut out of rock. Importantly, the women watched as Jesus was placed in the tomb and would therefore know where to go on Sunday morning to anoint, or so they thought, the body of Jesus. And so the remarkable life and ministry of Jesus has come to a sudden and unexpected close. The sheer shock of that 24-hour period must have been a stunning blow to the disciples and Jesus' close followers. Everything they'd hoped for had been shattered. But as we know, God was not finished. They would all have an even bigger surprise in store for them. And this would not be a bad surprise, but a very good one. And that is where we will pick up in the final chapter of the Gospel of Mark.